Hi, welcome to episode 2.
You sound silly. Try that again.
Hi. I forgot that I was going to have to really introduce this.
Yeah, we're keeping all of this, by the way.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, no, this is great.
Wonderful.
This is going to be our cold open.
It should
You
be.
fucking up the intro.
It should be. And we'll
right.
have a nice little title card come over it. Yeah, okay. Well, this is Fuck the Plan, the ADHD podcast by the ADHD Project.
I'm Aaron.
I'm Cass.
And what are we here to talk about today, Cass?
Today, we are going to talk about comorbidity of ADHD with other mental illnesses.
I think this is a good topic.
It is often misdiagnosed, or other mental illnesses are often misdiagnosed when somebody has ADHD or symptoms that present themselves as ADHD. I have a whole bunch of stats here. I will lead off by saying that there are 78% of false ADHD diagnoses that stem from people self-reporting symptoms.
Right.
The WebMD kind of thing where they read the symptoms and they're like, well, that sounds like me. I have ADHD. They might not.
You might not.
You might, but you might not. And it's kind of because ADHD has become pretty common, since the 90s.
We've learned a lot more about it.
We've learned a lot more about it. We're studying the effects of, screen time, of constant distractions on kids, the way it presents in adults. There's still a lot we're learning, but with it being so much more in the mainstream, and everyone, for the most part, has a pretty solid idea of what it is.
Yeah.
There are a lot of misdiagnoses, not just by people self-reporting, but also by medical and psychological professionals.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I
Nick,
think we're all about trying to figure out how to live your life in a way that you love and empowering people with ADHD to be able to manage their lives better. And I think if you don't know the score, if you don't know what you're working with and how these things work in your brain, or even if you've got the correct diagnosis, then that makes that incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible to do.
The worst case scenario of receiving an ADHD diagnosis is being supplied with medication that not only you may not need, but that could be actively harmful for you.
And taking it away from people who could actually need it with how short we are on being able to manufacture these medicines these days.
Right. Amphetamines, it's a heavy thing. When I first got put on Adderall, I would jokingly call it diet meth. It's kind of what it is.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be taking it if you don't need it.
Right.
And especially if you have an undiagnosed, untreated mental illness, either in the background or in place of what they think is ADHD, it can actually really mess you up. If you have a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, if you add regular amphetamines to that,
oh my God.
No.
Yeah.
No. You're gonna have frequent psychotic breaks that will be beyond control.
You're kind of making me think of that show House back in the day, where it's like, he'd spend like an hour looking into why somebody's liver wasn't working, and they're like, oh, well, this is obvious. Like, he was taking a medication that reacts with his heart, and he shouldn't be, it was always like, oh, well, duh, if he wasn't taking the wrong medication, he wouldn't be dying in our hospital. And it's like, that's how serious this is, because it's not like we're getting prescribed antihistamines over here,
And, I have bipolar disorder, specifically bipolar 1, holla. And even though I have that as well as ADHD, if you're not treated for the other illness, especially something like bipolar disorder, and you're taking these amphetamines, it can also be a problem. Even though you need the Adderall, it needs to be balanced out by the correct medication for the other issue, or you'll run into the same issue. You run into the same problem. When I was first diagnosed with ADHD, I was not on the correct medication for bipolar disorder. I had a history of being on the correct medication, on, the mix of Wellbutrin and Lamictal, Wellbutrin being an antidepressant, Lamictal being a mood stabilizer, had done well for me. Like many people with bipolar disorder, I flew a little too close to the sun and was like, I don't need these anymore. Fantastic. I was wrong. I needed them. And I was off.
Right.
Then they prescribed me, they diagnosed me with ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
My physician, who is great with physical illnesses, but not so great with mental illnesses, had never properly documented my bipolar disorder despite it being diagnosed by, Butler Hospital.
So this person basically wasn't taking notes, and it ended up harming you in
Correct.
the long run.
Because she is the one that suggested I go get tested, like, and have the full psych eval for ADHD.
Yeah.
And she preemptively said, okay, here you go. I'm prescribing you 30 milligrams of Adderall, which
Which is a hell of a lot.
I'm only 5'5", and I'm like, I'm
Dude,
not.
that's like close to the maximum that you should be taking. For the record, first of all, I don't care about weight, but I weigh probably double what Cassidy weighs, and that's what I was taking, and it was too much for me.
Yep. It was 30 milligrams, and anybody should have read my chart and said, you have bipolar disorder. We are not giving you Adderall until you go back on a mood stabilizer.
Right.
Because the Adderall, up, it will up your chance of mania. And especially if you have bipolar 1, the kind that I have,
Mhm.
those manic episodes are not just a couple days. Those manic episodes can go on for months
Yeah.
on end. And in those, for people who are not familiar with mania, because bipolar is another one that it gets thrown around. It bothers
Not
me
very
so much
understood.
when people use it as an adjective.
Mm.
And they're like, I'm so bipolar.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's an illness. That would be being like, man, I am so diabetes.
Dude,
Like,
I am so pancreatic cancer. You don't even know.
So,
I am so rheumatoid arthritis.
yeah, exactly. It's the same thing. And it luckily people are coming away from that, the connotation that just means moody.
Yeah.
That's not what it is.
No.
There are these
Just
cycles.
like, maybe like people think just being ADHD means being forgetful.
Yes.
Yes,
And
exactly like
that plays exactly into that, and that's something
Yeah.
we'll touch on. So, bipolar is characterized periods of severe depression, periods of heightened mood or mania, which can make you do really impulsive things. It manifests different in other people. It's a spectrum like anything. Sometimes people will have hallucinations. Luckily, that's not me.
Right.
I would go through impulsive behavior, maybe get a little too flirtatious, spend money that I don't have, never sleep. My house was so clean though.
It's funny how that
And
goes.
yeah, so obviously you add heavy duty stimulants to that
Yeah.
when you're not medicated to take care of those mood dips and those mood swings. I mean,
You're
I
adding
don't
fuel
have
to
to
the-
explain to you
You're
how
adding
that
fuel
could,
to the fire.
Exactly.
There, basically. You're making the problem worse.
and it led to an actual psychotic break. And I had to go on medical leave from work for months until I went back into a partial program. And they were like, you need to wean yourself off the Adderall, go back on the mood stabilizers, and then get on a lower dose of Adderall after the mood stabilizers are in your system.
Yeah.
And now that's what I do. I'm on 10 milligrams of Adderall
Yeah.
instead of 30.
Wow.
And
Imagine that.
back on the Lamictal and the Wellbutrin, and I'm pretty stable now.
Yeah. I'm glad that you're so open with sharing this too, because the message that we always try and send in the podcast is that we want you to live your life authentically, intentionally, and we want you to be able to lead a life that you love living. And if you are constantly, because you're on the wrong medication, if you are constantly going off in different directions and actively making your illnesses worse that you're having, like that's got to be incredibly difficult to deal with. And, we should probably say that talk to a doctor. We're not advocating taking any specific medication, but
Mhm.
we're just sharing our experiences and what has and hasn't worked for us. And the comorbidity thing that you brought up is so hugely crucial in my mind because you can't get to the point where you even understand what you want or need out of your life unless you are operating from a baseline environment.
Yes.
Obviously you're never going to be healed totally from mental illnesses, but I found somewhat of an opposite thing where I was trying to work on my mental health and my anxiety. And, I dealt with a lot of anxious thoughts, a lot of depressive episodes and things like that. And, having gone to the wrong person, I might have been diagnosed with bipolar on accident because it wouldn't have been right. But through working with my therapist and thinking back to my childhood when I, previously had been diagnosed, we said, you know what? Maybe there's something else here. And my therapist helped me go about the process of getting tested for ADHD. And it wasn't until I started treating my ADHD that my brain was in the right space to where I could pinpoint things from my anxiety. I had to be able to separate and think about what's strictly anxiety, what's ADHD, and what's one on top of the other, like, A, B, like, it was just all a mix of things. And when you start taking care of one thing at a time and the anxiety is not improving, you realize you start treating the ADHD, all of a sudden the anxiety starts getting better. You start to unlock these different pieces of the puzzle that are happening in your brain.
Mhm.
I don't believe that there's anybody out there who just has like a perfectly, functioning brain at all times.
Oh God,
Everybody's
no.
got something going on, right? But you need to start to unpack and figure those things out to really find out what environment you're operating in. Because if you don't know the rules, what are the rules? If you don't know the rules, then you can't work again, you can't counteract them. You can't work towards where you want to go.
Exactly. And it works in that way. Anxiety, the biggest things that are often confused for ADHD or that coexist with
Hmm.
ADHD. Generalized anxiety disorder is one of them.
Hmm.
Depression is another one. Autism,
Hmm.
believe it or not, bipolar disorder. Those
Yeah.
are four of the biggest ones.
Yeah. You got some
And
stats, right? You got some
got
numbers
some
to run
stats.
off.
Oh yeah, we came in, man, with these
Let's hear
numbers.
some numbers.
So the OCD actually is another one.
Oh, yeah.
And OCD is another whole thing where there are symptoms of OCD and a lot of other disorders. So it's a whole hot mess.
Right.
Luckily, now the stigma of therapy is starting to go down.
Right.
The thing I want to stress is to see a medical professional and don't do what I did and talk to your PCP about it,
Right.
because then,
See,
yeah,
a mental health professional.
yes, a mental
Yes.
health professional. And really, really just be open, be honest. If you're going in and you're paying a therapist and you're not telling them the truth, you're wasting money.
Yeah.
Um, you've got to go in there completely honest, talk about uncomfortable things, because I mean, it could literally be a matter of life and
Yeah.
death.
Absolutely. I've seen it happen to too many people that I know, to where it did not go treated and it did become a matter of life and death for them eventually. So, without recounting too many sad stories here, it will seriously impact your life and the lives of the people around you. So we owe it to ourselves if we want to get to a point of understanding ourselves, you know, that's really where we can start to learn and grow and improve and make progress on our lives is when we kind of understand where we're at with things. And the first step, I think, like you said, is being honest about it with yourself and especially if you're seeing a therapist, with your medical team.
And there are three main branches of ADHD symptoms
Mhm.
that will cause people to think it's something else.
Right.
One, an issue of cortical wiring, which is things like learning disabilities, language disabilities, speech impediments, motor difficulties. Now, if you're exhibiting those kinds of symptoms and it's a result of ADHD, medication is not going to help that, even if it is from ADHD.
Right.
Um, it's definitely not going to help it if it's not ADHD,
Yeah.
and it's something else. That's something that only learning and environmental accommodations can really help ease in environments where you really need to kind of be on the ball in those departments.
Yeah.
Another one is emotional regulation. That's where anger management, because irritability is a big
Yeah.
thing with ADHD.
Mhm.
Anger management, bipolar disorder, depression,
Yeah.
things like that. Another one is actually tic disorders, things like Tourette syndrome,
Mhm.
because we tend to fidget. That's why fidget spinners are so cool.
Yeah.
There's a
I
tactile
fidget a lot.
element.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Constantly when I had longer hair, I constantly used to go like this
Yeah,
because I
yeah.
just needed to be engaged somehow.
Yeah.
Um, and that is often, that and the tic disorders kind of have an overlap.
Yeah.
And these things need to be treated.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think kind of figuring out when you start to figure out like the different things that are going on and start to attribute them to where they're actually coming from, then you can address those things, because what I really always want to be doing in my life is doing some kind of improvements, making progress on something. And you cannot work towards something if a different side of your brain is actively working against it, you know? So you've got to figure out like, and I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying you can do it alone. You will need professional help, but like trying to figure out if are you fidgeting because it's ADHD? Are you fidgeting because you're anxious? Are you fidgeting because it's a tic disorder? Like there's multiple things that can do that just with anything else. And I like that we're at the point where we're starting to talk about that with mental health things now too.
And along the same time, though, with mental health being more in the spotlight, that risk of misdiagnosing yourself
Mhm.
gets higher.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with people reading fake news articles. Like,
Yeah.
it's out there. You see a lot of people, and you're like, I can relate to this. I probably have this. Granted, you're probably not in a position where you can just prescribe yourself stuff.
Right, right.
But if you start really believing, oh, I have borderline personality
Mhm.
disorder, which has a lot of shared symptoms with bipolar, but is also a completely different thing,
Mhm.
you're going to start operating under the impression that that's what you have, which has a different treatment plan therapeutically, not medicinally, but
Yeah.
that too, you know, and you're going to have the best of intentions on working on yourself, on doing that cognitive behavioral therapy, on really improving yourself, but you're going to be doing the wrong things
Yeah.
because you're trying to improve with techniques that might not work for what you've got.
And that might put you in a worse position than you were before. And that reminds me of this anecdote that I heard. It's like, yes, everybody struggles with some of these things some of the time. Like everybody struggles with walking into a room and forgetting what you went in there for. I bet you there's 50 people out there who are watching this on their phone, standing in front of your fridge, trying to figure out what you meant to pull out of your fridge. But at the same time, just because you have that sometimes doesn't mean that you have a disorder. Like the best example that I've heard, which is kind of funny, is like everybody is tall compared to a dog.
Mhm.
If you compare yourself to a cat, yeah, everybody is tall. But Shaq, Yao Ming, those dudes are tall all the damn time. And so what I'm getting at is that, like, yeah, compared to some people that maybe you do forget things more often. Maybe you are anxious more often, but you may or may not be to the point where it's affecting every aspect of your daily life at all times. Like literally, when I open my eyes in the morning, the stream of thought starts and does not stop until enough, meditation, caffeine, and medication have hit my brain. And to me, it's not funny that like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll chuckle with you if you walk in the room and you forget something. Like, okay, but it's not funny if you are going about your day and saying that, oh, I'm so OCD, I'm so ADHD, I just keep forgetting things, or oh, I just have like to have things neat and tidy. But it's like that's kind of like a slap in the face to people who genuinely struggle with this at all times. Like
Mhm.
it's not cutesy, haha, funny that you can't remember, if you brought your keys or not.
It's that whole kind of like, I call it the Tumblr girl
Yeah.
effect, where you have this subset of like, Tumblr is kind of the social media
Yeah.
outlet that these types of people flock to. It's often teenagers or like preteens who are feeling angsty because that's what happens when you're a teenager,
Yeah.
but they want it to be bigger than it is, so they have a reason for feeling that way, and they start projecting onto other things and latching onto things that they think explain it,
Right.
and it's harmful not only for them, but it's harmful for the people reading their blogs
Right.
that it can affect. It's incredibly dangerous, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't trust your own instincts. If you go to a doctor and something's up and they say, "Nah, you're fine," it could be worth getting a second opinion.
Yeah.
Especially there is an element of racial and gender bias in diagnosis.
There is.
Um, you know, with my race, I haven't experienced that, but I've certainly experienced it on the gender spectrum. And I know for a fact ADHD tends to be diagnosed in men a lot quicker than women.
Oh, yes.
And
Especially
it's
younger guys too.
yeah, and the ADHD world kind of tends to focus on children
Yeah.
more than anything. And it makes sense. A lot of symptoms will present themselves when you're a child.
Yeah.
But there are all of these adults that were growing up in the early 2000s that, maybe it wasn't as widespread, the conversation,
Yeah.
who still have ADHD, but because of their age, people are like, "Oh, no, I mean, it's too late to develop it." Well, they might
Yeah.
not have developed it. They might have always had it.
They probably did always have it. And so
Mhm.
that's why you owe it to yourself not to just like identify with it on Tumblr, but to like go and get some sort of evaluation or testing. And I know that that's not always the easiest process. I went through it myself, but at the
It's a
same
long
yeah. But at the same time, it's like if you need to go and get your blood pressure checked, you do it, right? You got to go and get your brain checked sometimes too, especially if you think that you're experiencing some of these things enough to where it can be a disorder. I mean, this is not a diagnosis, but if you go to the ADHDproject.com, we do have like a self assessment and you can go through and figure out about how many of these symptoms that you have, and it's worthwhile getting yourself officially checked too, but at least it can maybe give you the confidence to say to yourself, like, well, maybe I do have something here. It's not all in my head. Because what we're saying is we're not saying, don't ever diagnose yourself or don't, look into these things that you
Right.
have. What we're saying is that don't just say, oh, yep, I guess I'm a little ADHD and then move on with your life. Like go and do something about it and
Right.
sort it out.
Like the DSM when it comes to mental illnesses, the thing on the website.
Yeah.
You use that as a, okay, let me see. I exhibit a lot of those symptoms. I should probably get checked out.
Yes.
It's a guideline.
Right.
Just like, I wouldn't go and undergo a bunch of cancer tests if I don't have any symptoms of the
Right.
disease.
Exactly.
It's a waste of money. But if you're checking off enough of those boxes where it's a concern, do it.
Yeah.
And some of those stats that I was referring to in a study that was done, they tested people with ADHD, adults with ADHD, without ADHD, and saw how many other illnesses kind of overlapped. Of this study, 47% of adults with ADHD also had some sort of generalized anxiety disorder.
Wow. That's
That's
a
a
lot more
big
than I thought.
number. And those are two things that need to be treated differently, but with that unique diagnosis, it needs to be treated together as well.
Yeah.
And, if you're just popping Xanax for your anxiety, that's it's not gonna help your ADHD and vice versa.
Yeah.
Actually, Adderall without an
Yeah.
anti-anxiety would probably make the anxiety ramp up.
Yeah.
19.5% of adults with ADHD did not have it. The rest of the gap, people didn't know what they were taking. There's a gap in the numbers here.
Yeah.
Bipolar disorder, 19.4% of adults that were tested with bipolar disorder have ADHD.
19. That's like a lot more than I thought. Like
Yeah,
I would
19
think
sounds low, but it's not. It's not.
that's like 20%. So like for every 100 people, there's 20 of them who also have
Yep.
that. That's a lot more than you'd think. I thought maybe we'd hear like 5, 8, 12%, but like almost 20 is a big number. And it's got to be so difficult just to figure out where you're at and what you're working with. And like
Yeah.
if the idea is to treat things so you can get to a baseline to figure out what you want for your life, to do the actions that are going to make you feel better. There's a lot of thinking that has to happen in that process. And you can't do that if you don't know where you're coming from. Like you might be thinking one way and then you've got a totally different set of rules happening in your brain that you aren't aware of. And like
Mhm.
it's that common that like 47%, if you have ADHD, you probably are dealing with some kind of an anxiety, and
Yep.
that's a lot more than I thought it might be.
And then with depression, with chronic depression,
Mhm.
not the, oh, I feel a little depressed. We all feel a little
Everybody
depressed.
gets the Sunday scaries, but
Lovely way to put it. But it's not the same as having chronic depression. And that's another term that gets thrown around
Right,
very often. And it's like, you don't have depression, you're feeling depressed.
right.
With people who are actually diagnosed with a chronic depression disorder, it's 12.3 of those adults also have ADHD.
Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about how people with ADHD are talked to their entire lives. Because, like, from a very young age, we internalize this like guilt and shame of like, oh, you're not living up to your potential, or
Yeah.
you're not this, or like you feel like, especially before you've been diagnosed, like you're working so hard and not getting the same results as other people that you're seeing. And if you don't know where you're at, like with ADHD, or that you even have it, it's a very easy and quick way to get into like spiraling downwards and depressive thoughts, and like it doesn't surprise me at all.
And you're often treated as if you're stupid
Yeah.
when you have ADHD. And actually it's quite the contrary. A lot of people with ADHD, and along with some of the things that are misdiagnosed or comorbid with ADHD, such as bipolar and autism, in general, a lot of people who are diagnosed with that have above average
Yeah.
IQs. It's not a lack of intelligence, it's a lack of understanding that is causing you to be treated in a sort of patronized, infantilizing way.
Yeah.
And it's not helpful for your self-esteem. It's not helpful in understanding who you are, and it's not helpful in being able to talk openly about how you're feeling. There's
Right.
this shame attached to it that you shouldn't be ashamed of it.
No, and it's like if I were being lazy, I would be having fun. Like I would
Yeah.
be relaxed. I would be not a care in the world if I just was being lazy and didn't want to do
And
it.
we're never relaxed.
No, I'm the opposite. Look at me, dude. Psychological problems up to here. Like you got like I am constantly every second of every day fighting with myself to do something. To like, all right, get up from where you are sitting and go to the fridge and get yourself the water that you desperately need.
Yeah.
Like, dude, you've got to fight with yourself to do stuff like that sometimes, especially if you're unmedicated. So
Yeah.
it's like
Or you mean to go do
yeah, well,
it,
you mean to, and
and
then
you're like, "Oh, wait, it's been 3 hours and I never drank that water?"
yeah.
Oops.
Exactly, and then the anxiety sets in, you know, and it's like this all spirals so quickly and easily, and a lot of it comes from the way that we're taught to think about these kinds of things, and it's not a personal failing that you have a mental disorder or a psychological or neurological issue, something like ADHD or OCD, and the fact that people don't understand it and judge against it is something that I don't know if we can ever stop, you know, entirely as a society. But at the same time, like you need to know your brain and you need to know how
Yes.
you operate because you can't do like one of the best things you can do is say, all right, well, like I don't care what everybody else thinks, I'm doing me. But you can't do that unless you understand yourself enough. And if you can't sometimes you don't even know that you're in that point because you've been talked to and made to feel this way after your whole life. And you get to that point where you're like, oh, well, it's just not worth it. I'm just going to continue doing this thing and being miserable. And then you
Mhm.
get these people who, through no fault of their own, have been made to think that they're not as capable as they actually are.
And on the flip side, having a mental illness of any kind or having a disorder like ADHD, it's not a get out of jail free card for your behavior.
Oh, no.
You can't just use it to write things off. I can't just be like, yeah, well, I dropped $300 I don't have on a custom David Bowie jumpsuit. I did that once. Um,
It's a great jumpsuit.
it's fantastic. It's worth it now 4 years later when I'm not dealing with the fallout. But, you can't say, oh, well, I did that. But you know what? That's perfectly rational. That's totally normal
Yeah.
behavior. I was manic. It's fine.
I,
No,
no.
I have to sit down and be like, my mania is affecting me and making me financially unstable. I need to come up with a way to safeguard. Or, you need to be aware of how it's affecting other people as
Yeah.
well. Like, yeah, I joke around about being a shitty employee when I was an investment worker, but there were clients I was probably neglecting
Yeah.
who might have really needed me. And, I do think about that and I'm like, I should have gotten out. I should have quit that job. I shouldn't have waited that for them to fire me.
Right.
I was negatively impacting other people.
Yeah. And you know, it strikes me that you have a lot of self-awareness about it and about the
It's a
situation.
blessing and a curse.
Yeah, no, I get it. Like if you've ever related to one of those memes that, you know, it shows like the bar graph and you're like in that part where you're just smart enough to know your flaws and shortcomings, but not like smart enough to do anything about it. Like sometimes I feel that way. But at the same time, like all of the things that you said and a lot of what we've been talking about so far have been kind of pointing towards this self-awareness piece where you said, you know, my mania is causing me to do this. If you don't know that you have it,
You're
then you're
never
not
going to
going to be
have
able to
that
have that moment
awareness
of realization. And so a
and you'll
big
never fix the behavior.
yeah, a big key is spending time self-reflecting and looking inwards and probably finding things that you're not going to like or you're not going to feel good about. Like
It's not easy.
it's not, but it is worth it and it's worthwhile and it's necessary because it's a microcosm of what you need to do externally in the world for things. So like if you want to make things happen outside of you, if you want to find, you know, the best career path for you, if you want to, you know, get married, buy a house, have children, even if you don't want to do those things, if you want to run a play, if you want to write a book, if you want to make music, you've got to get to a point where you are periodically reviewing and reflecting against yourself. You know, you have
Yes.
to look inwards, figure out, you know, status check. Where am I at? Where am I heading? What's the game plan here? And
Yep.
you can't do that unless you have the roadmap and unless you have somewhat of an idea of where you're at. So I think the first step to being self-aware is figuring out what you got going on.
Because ultimately, no matter how supportive your friends are, your partner is, your job is, your mental health professionals, no matter how supportive these people are, At the end of the day, it is on you to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
And yes, mental illness can make that really difficult. It can make it feel impossible, but it's not. And if you're lucky enough to have resources like supportive friends and family and a mental health professional that you can trust who's reliable, that's fantastic. You're doing better than a lot of other people, but it's still not on them. They
Yeah.
can do what they can, but if you don't have the willpower, if you don't have the desire to get better, you will not get better.
Yeah.
You might have days where you feel better, and then you might do what I did and say, I don't need the meds.
Yeah.
Again, I did. And it's up to you. Like the tagline of the play I wrote is love can't save you, but it can help you save yourself.
Right.
And you can't be putting that onto other people, even your doctors.
Right.
They're important to confirm and to help treat, but they can't make you better.
No.
They can work with you to help you make you better. And a lot of that, again, because ADHD, we just focus on kids so much.
Yeah.
Like when I was getting all these stats, almost every study I saw was about kids, and I had to really scour the web to find adult stats.
Yeah.
And it makes sense, especially nowadays with all the screen time,
Hmm.
Oh, my kid won't shut up. Let me shove an iPad in their face.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not like going into technology is bad because there are bad parts of it,
Yeah.
but there are also very good parts of it. But we have to be aware of what that screen time and that instant gratification from a young age can do.
Yeah.
As it was, I mean, the COVID lockdown,
Yeah.
the symptoms that everybody was exhibiting with ADHD shot up. People like me who had ADHD, I wasn't diagnosed at the time. I
Yeah.
got diagnosed in 2021.
Hmm.
So 2020, I was on lockdown. I didn't have my dog yet, and I lived by myself. So I was alone all the time. And it got to a point where even now I struggle to watch TV without playing a game on my phone.
Oh yeah.
Because it was just, you're bored, you want engagement, you're doing this, you're ordering stuff off DoorDash, you're
Yeah.
ordering stuff on Amazon, you're doing all this stuff. And now all of a sudden I'm like, I want to be able to watch a show. The easiest thing to do to sit down and watch TV without playing a game and then missing a plot point.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mention it that way, especially in talking about kids, because I really think that there's kind of two parts to a lot of this with the overdiagnosis, so to speak, in children. Because I think it's, first of all, it's true that it can be overdiagnosed in children, and also true that it's underdiagnosed in adults. I don't think those two things have to be like mutually
They
exclusive.
actually kind of support each
Yeah,
other.
but what I'm getting at is there are a lot of children who don't really have ADHD who are diagnosed with it because they are put in that position. Maybe it is screen time, maybe it's, something else about their environment. But we as a society need to get better at saying and rather than or, because you can have an overusage of screen time and have ADHD.
Actually, when your brain is developing,
Yeah.
it's not like it's something you're simply born with.
Yeah.
When your brain is still developing, those external factors like screen time or like, oh, yeah, oh, you're hungry? Okay. 10 minutes later, DoorDash is there. Like
Yeah.
that instant gratification from a young age can actually cause and develop ADHD.
Right.
It's not, that's a common misconception of a mental illness or a disorder is something you're just born with.
Right.
External factors can cause it. In bipolar and ADHD, there have been reports of trauma,
Yeah.
like physical trauma. One of my favorite songwriters, Dessa,
Hmm.
she was in a traumatic car accident, exhibited physical trauma, and ended up with bipolar disorder. And
That's crazy.
Yeah. And there are kids who have, childhood trauma, psychological trauma, and the restlessness of wrestling with that manifests itself into ADHD.
Yeah.
There are external things that are going on here that are often ignored. It's not black and white at all.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point to make. And, just because you have kids who shouldn't be diagnosed with ADHD doesn't mean that we should overlook the people who are. It is totally possible that you could have some things that look like ADHD and then grow up and grow out of that. But for the majority of people and people who do actually have ADHD, you don't grow out of that. And I think for years as a society, we thought that people just grew out of it because, it might have been like a 50-50 split with
Mhm.
kids who did actually have it and who weren't, who were still getting diagnosed as kids.
And again, that gender split, like
Yeah, young boys
boys
specifically.
constantly
Yeah,
and young girls are just told to grow
they're
up.
dismissed for
Yeah.
sure. And then you get to the point where, like, all right, now a huge sample size of this population are now adults. And the ones who did actually have ADHD are all rediscovering that now and saying, oh, well, it got worse. I didn't grow out of
Yep.
it. And the people who did grow out of it are like, oh, well, look at me. I'm perfectly fine now. It's like, well, did you really have it in the first place? And this is why it's so important to not over or underdiagnose. And I don't think that we should only be looking at kids, but I think we should look at children from a developmental perspective and then look at adults as well, because this can and is by and large a lifetime disorder when you develop it.
Mhm.
So it does not just go away like people thought. And I think changing the narrative around that, it's kind of the kind of thing that it's not going to happen overnight, but we have to take small steps towards that. And I think that really goes along with a lot of what we've been talking about is
Yes.
if you do find yourself that you're comorbid with a certain, disorder or anything like that, you know, we don't mean to say that you can just turn this around overnight and all of a sudden like, well,
No.
tomorrow I'm going to wake up with a fresh sense of diligence and dedication to repairing my mental health that I have never once exhibited in the past 33 years. Like, it's just not going to happen.
And it is not a linear process
No.
at all.
But it is small steps. And this is something that I'm always saying is that you need to make your ultimate goal just progress because
Mhm.
you can always hit that every single day. You can take one step. There's days where I'll admit I don't do a damn thing to move myself forward. But if you do it more days than not, then you're heading in the right direction. And it might be a huge step to call up a therapist's office and make an appointment for the first time.
Exactly. If all you do tomorrow
Yeah.
is look up therapists in your area,
Hmm.
you don't even have to call them. You just look them up.
Make a list.
Make a list of people that seem promising. Look at what they specialize in.
Hmm.
Make sure it vibes. And you just have a list. And if that's all you do today, that's more than you did yesterday
Yeah.
to help yourself. I just got my fiance through watching The Good Place, one of my favorite shows. And there was that line in one of those later episodes that's not, I'm paraphrasing, but it's not a matter of whether people are good or bad. It's a matter of whether or not they're trying to be better than they were yesterday.
Right.
And yeah, that's applied to like a moral and ethical standpoint in the show, but it also applies to self-preservation, self-care.
Yeah.
If you're just trying to do better for yourself than you're doing yesterday, you're on the right path.
Yeah. You might have a big goal in mind. You might have an end state, and you might, like me, like I did for a long time, feel like it's not worth it to start to get there, to try at it. You say, oh, I'm always going to be this way.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I realized that big steps are only the result of many small steps did I start finding it possible. You know what I mean? Like maybe I couldn't just all of a sudden turn around my, mental health, physical health, and financial situation all in one day. But if each day I tried to take a step forward on each of them, then eventually you can start to do what you really set out to do. But it's keeping that sort of big picture in mind through the day to day of these small steps, which is obviously not easy. It takes a lot of work, but it's all of these little small steps that ultimately get you where you're going.
Exactly. Exactly. And again, nobody can take those steps for you. It's really nice to have cheerleaders to help cheer you on.
It
But
is.
you have to take the steps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, kind of as a closing note on mental health in general, I would really encourage anybody who has any kind of questions about it to reach out to someone, even if it's a family member or a friend at first, just to talk. And if you in your life have somebody who you think may be struggling, it's important to reach out to them too, because it does go both ways. And,
Yes.
our show is about folks with ADHD trying to live a more fulfilled life and one that makes them happy. And if you are struggling mentally, it's going to be a huge stumbling block in the way of you getting to where you want to be. And we don't say this because it's going to make you more productive, but because it's going to make you happier as a person. And yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's hard work, but it's kind of like we talked about in the last episode. Sometimes you have to take a hit. You have to take a short dip in order for things to get better. There's a funny paradox kind of that if you are putting along and doing so and just trying to get better, it's going to take you a lot longer than if you were doing really bad and all of a sudden tried to get better, because it's easier to make to like jumpstart your momentum if you're starting from way behind.
Hmm.
If you start, if there's a race and there's 10 people in the race and you start from the front, you know, you can only gain so much. But if you start from the back, you can really make a lot of progress in a shorter period of time. If you start from a worse position, it kickstarts your momentum and your growth, because you have to really put a push and an effort into it. And taking that step back to realize, like, maybe I have to stop and slow down and take a hit for a second and deal with some unpleasant things to ultimately be in a better position, instead of just staying mediocre and miserable in your mental health.
And I'm thinking, in the Tough Mudders, one of the obstacles that's there every year is called Everest.
Hmm.
It's a ramp that pretty much starts real low and it just goes straight up.
Hmm.
And the thing is, you need to sprint with enough momentum to kind of jump, grab onto a rope, and pull yourself up
This
straight
is something that I will never experience in my life, by the way. So if you're thinking the same thing, we'll just take Cass's word for it.
There's videos of it, and it can be really entertaining because some people just face plant.
It's like Ninja Warrior, right? Like American Ninja Warrior.
Yes,
You got to run
a
and
lot
jump
like
up
that.
the thing.
I
Okay.
would implore you all to Google Tough Mudder Everest. The point is, you see people who are like, if I squat and just jump from the bottom, maybe I can get the rope and pull myself up. It never works.
Yeah.
They start closer to the ramp and they'll jump. They can't get high enough. They'll smack their face on the ramp. Again, very funny for those of us in the back. Or you can do what you should do and what it's designed to do, which is you start further back, you start sprinting, and you start gaining the momentum, and then you can actually propel yourself
Yeah.
enough. It's it's a comparison, but it's the same kind of philosophy.
Yeah. You have to take those steps back to give yourself the momentum to surpass where you were. Otherwise, that spinning your wheels, muddling kind of feeling,
Mhm.
that's a terrible feeling, and it will just go on forever. And like, we
Yeah.
hate feeling like we're spinning our wheels with ADHD.
And I think it's an ADHD thing to just want to be go, 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 go.
It is.
Metaphorically, you need it to take a step back to evaluate all of the things that we talked about
Yeah.
here.
And pragmatically too, because again, if you're just spinning your wheels, you're caught in that cycle. It's hard to see where you need to go. But when you back up and take that bird's eye view, you have a better idea of how you can plan.
Exactly.
Well, I'm Aaron,
I'm Cass.
and this has been Fuck the Plan, the ADHD Project Podcast.